Tilea's Troubles, Part 110, The Assault on Ebino, Chapter 1, Spring 2404. Biagino had grown more and more furious on his journey from the defeat at Pontramola to the city of Ebino. When the Duchess Maria had died, his mind, twisted with all the proud hatred and dark cruelty of vampirism, had been released from its slavish, besotted enthralment to her, so that now he was enraged almost to madness by the thought of the glamour she had cast over him. As he progressed, anger had so suffused his being that he cared not a jot for the army that was pursuing him, and instead of fleeing further, as was surely the most sensible course of action considering the recent defeat and the enemy's obvious strength, he decided he would possess and rule Maria's city, take all that was once hers as partial recompense for her belittling dominion over him. He had been a pathetic creature in life, and even in undeath, until Maria's demise, he had been the same. Well, he decided, no more. Now, a few weeks later, with the enemy soon about to attack the city, and having brought only his paltry remnant army with him, his fury had abated, to be replaced with much more mixed emotions, flavoured throughout with a substantial dose of self-interest. Luckily for her, the sorceress, whom Maria had left in charge of the city, had not met Biagino immediately upon his arrival. Otherwise he would most assuredly have killed her on sight, out of sheer spite. When he did finally meet her, he had regained sufficient composure to accept her servitude, listen to her report concerning what forces she commanded within the city, and to recognise he needed whatever help she could give to defend it. The enemy had been preparing for their assault for days, fashioning up contraptions to gain entry. He knew full well the strength of their artillery, big and small, having watched the volleys at Naroccia tear his most mighty and monstrous pawns to pieces. Then witnessed the same yet again at Pontramola. Although the city was circumvallated with strong, moated walls, parapeted throughout, he was unwilling to risk receiving even a fraction of the battering the enemy had proved capable of delivering in the past, not when his own forces were so meagre. So he commanded that none of his soldiers should mount the walls, but rather slink unseen in the shadows below and await his command before revealing themselves. Thus it was that the Disciplinati di Nagash, commanded by the two remaining thralls of La Fraternita di Morti Irrequieti, were now mustered in their full remaining strength in the yard below him, silently waiting for his order to climb the steps. Upon the other side of the city gate, the sorceress's garrison of skeletons stood similarly, with a corpse cart close by to augment the magical current feeding their animation. The sorceress had conjured a host of restless, accursed spirits from the most haunted corners of the city, and they too awaited command, swirling and swooshing around each other, like the fronds of water plants plating and unwinding in the eddies of a stream. The sorceress herself, an old crone who had mastered little more than the rudiments of the necromantic art, yet to her credit had still managed over time to raise the force aforementioned, was hiding too. Like Biagino himself, she was tucked away on the battlements, in the shadow of a nearby tower, from where she could watch over her garrison force, but also take an occasional peek at the enemy. His chess pieces set, Biagino now waited impatiently for the enemy to make the opening move. Upon several recent occasions, one of his thralls had crept out in the darkest hours of the night to spy upon the foe, and had reported the mustering of their force and their constructions. He knew they had bridges with which to cross the moat, but only a handful. Surely, Biagino mused, there is sufficient strength here to prevent frightened men clambering up ladders at only a few places along the walls. The walls of Ebino were in his favour, and he rated his chances. But then the enemy also had their guns, and their magical colossus, their wizards and priests. At least their mounted men-at-arms, of which he had spied a good number at Pontramola, would be forced to wade through mud on foot, unable to bring their lances to bear, made little better than militia, if somewhat more armoured. The Duchess, he now realised, had been a vainglorious fool when it came to war. Despite knowing her uncle and vampiric sire, Duke Alessandro, had perished in battle at the bridge of Pontramola, she had forsaken the stone walls and moat of the city, which would hinder the foe tremendously, and had charged out to attack the enemy entrenched at the very same bridge. There to die. He was glad of her folly, for her death had released his mind. All he had to do was survive this assault, and he would have time to enjoy his newfound freedom, to revel in the power that could now be his. Having glanced over the crenellations several times, Biagino saw the enemy had indeed left all their horses behind. Even their wooden constructions were being pushed by men, not beasts. They were divided unevenly by the road to the city gate, with 2 of their bridges upon one side and the 3rd on the other. Along the road itself they were pushing what at first appeared to be a bombard, but which Biagino's wickedly nimble eyes made out to be a huge petard, so heavy it had to be mounted on a carriage. The largest enemy regiment, consisting of spearmen, obliquely flanked the petard. It seemed plain that the enemy general intended those men to storm the gate as soon as it was blown. The rest of the soldiers on that flank were heavily armoured and in smaller companies. They must be the nobility, he thought, deprived of their steeds by the necessities of an assault. He could not help but smile as he imagined their steel carapaced bodies sinking deep in the moat or plummeting from a ladder to crash hard into the rock footings. Also on that flank were 2 cannons, which perhaps explained why the soldiers on that side had only one bridge. They must be expecting the artillery to breach one spot, so that they could pour across the moat to access the gap thus made. Upon the other side of the road were the Riemann contingent, as well as more Portamaggiorans. Biagino had seen several of the regiments before, when his eyes were actually alive rather than just not dead, including the mercenary regiments of dwarfs. The Colossus drew his gaze first, as it would anyone's. But there were also 2 bridges, a large regiment of armoured foot soldiers, and 3 regiments of crossbowmen, one of which was pushing a bridge. And well they might, he thought, for they've nothing to shoot at. The whole army was on the move. Soon, he decided, they would learn how much more difficult it would be to fight against him compared to the Duchess. Considering his whole army was merely waiting, hiding, Biagino chanced a better look at the enemy, to ascertain what, if anything, he might have missed before. The wheeled petard was making progress up the road, but at a pace which meant it would be some time before it reached the gate, time he intended to make use of as best he could. His keen eyes could make out that the men pushing it were already tired. Even from this distance he could see the throbbing arteries at their throats as their hearts pumped hard and fast to feed their muscles with sanguine sustenance. The thought caused a pang of hunger to suffuse his being. It had been some time since he ate. Several handgunners escorted the petard, and in its rear the large regiment of spearmen had angled their march to bring them onto the road behind. Biagino's earlier guess was proving more likely to be correct. They obviously intended to swarm the gate once it was broken. It occurred to him that all the enemy could presently see was stone walls, as if they were attacking an entirely undefended city. He wondered now whether the sight would encourage or worry them. The living always feared his kind. He remembered feeling that fear himself before receiving the gift of vampirism. He laid his hand upon the stone wall, his mighty ally in this fight, and allowed himself a moment to recall his mortal years. What could be learned, he wondered, from his murky memories of that life which might help him here and now? Suddenly, however, his nascent train of thought was lost completely, as pain surged through him, sapping the unholy vigour that sustained his corpse body in the material world. Clutching at the stone to prevent himself falling, he turned to look across the front of the gate at the wall on the other side. There was the sorceress, visibly reeling from a similar shock, and he knew full well what must have happened. Her amateurish bungling of the winds of magic, presumably intended to supplement the ranks of the osseous warriors below her, had whirled uncontrollably from her grasp and surged savagely, in such a way as to sting both her and he. Hissing in anger, he knew he had been weakened, and before the enemy had so much as fired a shot or loosed a bolt. Why, he asked himself, did I not kill her as soon as I found her? Shaking his head in an effort to clear it, he snuck another peek at the enemy. More time had passed than he had thought. His pain had been quite the distraction. for they were considerably closer than the last time he looked. The Colossus strode ahead of all the rest, directly towards the moat. This intrigued Biagino, for he had watched the monstrous artifact move on 2 previous occasions, and knew its gait was stiff, if steady, imbued with a sturdy deliberateness. He would be very surprised if it were able to cross the moat, for such a feat would surely require a nimbleness it did not possess. Beside the Colossus were 2 of the moat bridges. Perhaps the enemy intended their metal giant to step over one of those. This too seemed an unlikely prospect, for its weight would surely splinter the timbers to send its foot into the water and so topple the whole. Lurching to one side, still dizzied by the magical harm, Biagino glanced instead at the enemy's other flank. There, the 3rd bridge had made similar progress, pushed by the dismounted noblemen and flanked by more handgunners. Just then, he felt the enemy's magic, not any harm from it, but merely its use. The etheric winds flowed through the foe, and he realised that the fellow he had spied earlier walking beside the Colossus, red-robed with a white turban, was their strongest wizard. Perhaps it was that man who gave the Colossus its purpose, directing its mindless activities. Again, however, he sensed a burning sourness to the etheric flow, just enough to reveal that the enemy had also suffered harm in their attempts at conjuration. At first he smiled in satisfaction, but that did not last long, for it now occurred to him that something might be tainting all the winds of magic here, making them somehow noxious, so any attempt to cast magic might prove further detrimental to his health. 2 loud thuds followed the sound of the enemy's cannon blasts, announcing the first of their artillery shots, likely intended for the gate, but instead hitting the wall that bore it. Splinters of stone spattered out to splash in the waters of the moat below. "They'll have to do better than that," thought Biagino, then turned to look at the courtyard behind him. There his bambinos, commanded by his thralls, stood waiting, satisfactorily unperturbed by the sound of shooting. Both Biagino and the sorceress now attempted to cure themselves magically of the injuries they had suffered. But Biagino's attempt was quelled by the enemy's counter-magic, while she simply fumbled the words of her incantation. No matter, he thought, there's plenty of time yet. At least the wind seemed more favourable now, and less dangerous to casters. Outside, the enemy pushed onwards. Unknown to Biagino, Lord Alessio himself commanded his regiment of sea-wolves, armed with great swords and clad in plate armour, urging them on as they shoved their burden towards the defences. Again, Biagino sensed the workings of the enemy's magic, and although not all seemed to be successful, he knew that at least one of their spells had come to fruition. If he had been looking over the parapet just then, he would have seen the dismounted knights momentarily move with unnatural swiftness to push their bridge that bit closer to the moat. He did, however, look just in time to see all 3 bridges come crashing down to span the moat. The first had mercenary crossbowmen pushing it, the second was moved by the plate-armoured foot soldiers, and the third was attended by the dismounted nobility of Porto Maggiore. The men at the second, led by their general himself, were champing at the bit to get at the walls, and swiftly pulled aside the bridge's boulder-carrying carriage to allow themselves to begin pouring over immediately. The enemy's cannons now shifted their aim and lobbed 2 iron round shots at the wall to the east of the gate. Once again, the shots buried themselves into the stone, flaring cracks from their points of impact, but the wall stood. Now, decided Biagino, it was time to mount the walls, so that the attackers at the 3rd bridge would see Ebino was not undefended. His command was unspoken, indeed little more than a thought, for his bambinos and thralls were like unto marionettes for him to make dance as he pleased with mere finger flicks. Up went half of the disciplinati di Nagash, but not those behind the wall targeted by the enemy artillery, which no doubt they intended to breach rather than assault with ladders. There his congregation stayed put, to face whatever attempted to climb through any breach caused. The sorceress, too, ordered her city garrison up, to ensure the enemy's commander would be required to work very hard if he was to take possession of the wall before him. Embarrassed by her earlier failure, perhaps, the witch now wound together as many magical eddies as she could muster to cast the invocation of Nehek, if only to restore herself to full strength, and so be best prepared to face the fight ahead. But the curse Biagino had sensed earlier still lingered, so that yet again she lost her hold on the slippery swirl of arcane energies. They spun, instead, into an uncontrollable maelstrom, which once again knocked the fetid wind out of her. So befuddled was she by what had happened, she failed entirely to notice that this time, just like the last, several skeletons had nevertheless been raised to join the ranks of the regiment now climbing onto the wall. Biagino felt the blow too, and as the pain of his fresh injuries fuelled the fury of his anger, he staggered on the battlements, struggling merely to stay on his feet. Somewhere in his mind, little more than a flicker within the whirling rage engulfing the rest, real doubt had crept in. "Perhaps," said a whispered voice with a mocking tone, sounding ever so like the Duchess, "today is not your time after all." As both the undead commanders reeled, Lord General Alessio Falcone of Porto Maggiore led his sea-wolves in a ladder assault of the wall. As yet, this was the only bridge being used for an assault. At the first bridge, the crossbowmen lugged the carriage away to allow a company of skirmishing bravi to cross, led by the Riemann Brigade's commander, Captain Soldatovia, while at the other bridge the dismounted knights simply waited, for there was no point in crossing until the wall was breached. They watched as another round shot shook the wall to the left of their bridge, then shuddered as a second, louder sound assaulted them. At the back, several turned to see one of the guns had shivered apart, killing the crew and master gunner serving it. On the road, the petard was gaining momentum, its pushers thankful that they now had a road to traverse and not rough ground. Behind it, the spearmen came on too, with the famous Riemann Morite priest fighting Father Antonello at their head, along with the Portomaggioran nobleman Marcus Portelli. Biagino was vaguely aware of the flow of magic channelled by the enemy, but so dazed was he that he only managed to dispel one of their conjurations, and even then he knew not what he had prevented. One spell that did get through was a law of light blessing, which enlivened the climbing sea-wolves, and perhaps was the reason the fully plate-armoured Lord Alessio was the quickest to top the wall, great hammer in one hand, to commence the first close combat of the assault. Despite all the disadvantages of assaulting a wall using ladders, the attackers, filled with hatred for the foe, divinely inspired by the presence of the Morite priest Father Dado Bendali, enspelled to move with unnatural speed, and with their leader armed with an enchanted warhammer, surged up to rain down blow after blow, and the fleshless defenders began tumbling from the wall in droves.